Sometimes the places we abandon hold the deepest pieces of our hearts. Sometimes what others call cursed is simply waiting for someone brave enough to love it back to life. High in the Colorado Rockies sits a broken cabin that nobody in Millfield would touch for 15 years. The locals whispered it was cursed after the tragedy that happened there. Every spring, they talked about tearing it down, but nobody ever did. Then Jeremiah Pike showed up with his dog Duke and started fixing it. This mountain man had lived alone for decades, keeping to himself and trading furs. But something about that cabin called to him. As he pulled away rotted boards and cleared vines, the town watched. They didn't understand why he'd risk everything for a place everyone feared. What was Jeremiah's real connection to that abandoned cabin? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine-covered slopes like memories refusing to fade, and Jeremiah Pike stood at the edge of the clearing, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The cabin before him had once been a thing of beauty, hand-hewn logs fitted with the precision of a master craftsman, a wraparound porch that invited evening conversations, and windows positioned to catch the first light of dawn breaking over the continental divide. Now it sagged like an old man's shoulders, burdened by years of neglect and the weight of what had happened within its walls. The roof had partially collapsed on the north side, allowing rain and snow to rot the interior. Vines had claimed the foundation, and saplings sprouted from the gutters. Most folks would see only ruin. But Jeremiah saw something else entirely, potential and perhaps redemption. Duke, his German shepherd companion, padded silently beside him, the dog's amber eyes scanning the forest with the vigilance that comes from years of living where civilization ended. The animal had been with Jeremiah for 8 years now, ever since he'd found the half-starved pup abandoned at a truck stop in Wyoming. They understood each other in the way that only comes when words become unnecessary. When survival depends on reading the smallest changes in wind direction or the subtle shift in a partner's breathing. "What do you think, old friend?" Jeremiah asked, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of a man who spent more time talking to mountains than to people. "Worth the trouble?" Duke's tail gave a single wag, which Jeremiah had learned to interpret as cautious optimism. The dog had good instincts about places, and if he sensed no immediate danger, that was endorsement enough. The town of Millfield lay 3 miles down the winding mountain road, a collection of weathered buildings that had grown up around the old mining operations. Most of the silver had played out by the 1920s, but the town had survived on logging, a modest tourist trade, and the stubborn determination of folks who preferred mountain solitude to city noise. Population hovered around 800 souls, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but respected the unwritten code that some stories were better left untold. Jeremiah had been coming to Millfield for supplies twice a year for the better part of 2 decades, trading furs and handcrafted items for coffee, ammunition, and the occasional medical supplies. He kept a small cabin higher up the mountain, accessible only by an old mining trail that most people assumed had been abandoned long ago. The townspeople knew him by reputation more than familiarity. The mountain man who paid his bills in cash, never caused trouble, and disappeared back into the wilderness as quietly as he'd arrived. But this trip was different. This time, he'd loaded his pack with tools instead of trade goods, and he'd brought along a canvas tarp that had seen him through a dozen harsh winters. The weathered photograph tucked deep in his inside pocket seemed to burn against his chest with each step he'd taken toward this place. Sarah McKinnon had spotted him first, as she tended to do with most everything that happened in Millfield. She ran the general store with the sharp-eyed efficiency of a woman who'd learned to read people's intentions long before they spoke them aloud. At 63, she'd outlasted 2 husbands and a mining accident that had taken her eldest son, and she approached life with the cautious wisdom of someone who understood that good news was often followed by its opposite. Jeremiah Pike's back. She'd announced to her husband, Frank, as he restocked the canned goods that morning. But he's not here for supplies. Frank McKinnon had been born in Millfield and expected to die there, and in his 70 years he'd developed an encyclopedia knowledge of local affairs. He knew which families had feuds dating back 3 generations, which men drank too much when the snow got heavy, and which women had hearts large enough to forgive their husbands' seasonal lapses in judgment. "How do you figure that?" he'd asked, though he'd learned long ago that Sarah's intuitions about people were rarely wrong. "Tools," she'd said simply. "Man's got a canvas pack full of tools, and he's walking up toward the Henderson place." The Henderson place. Even speaking the name seemed to lower the temperature in the store. Frank had set down the can of peaches he'd been holding and walked to the window, shading his eyes against the morning glare. Sure enough, there was Pike, moving up the old logging road with his dog beside him. A purposeful stride that suggested a man who'd made up his mind about something. "Been 15 years, Frank had murmured. 16 this November, Sarah had corrected, and nobody's been fool enough to go up there since. The tragedy had become part of Millfield's collective memory, the kind of story that got passed down in hushed tones and careful euphemisms. The Henderson family had been newcomers, city folks from Denver who'd bought the cabin as a retreat from urban life. Tom Henderson had been a successful architect, and his wife Marie had taught music at the university. They'd brought their 2 children, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Michael, up for what was supposed to be a perfect mountain Christmas. The details of what happened that December night had been pieced together by investigators, but the emotional impact had settled into the town's bones like winter cold. Carbon monoxide from a faulty heating system had claimed all 4 lives while they slept. A silent killer that had turned a family's dream vacation into a nightmare that haunted the entire community. Since then, the cabin had stood empty. The extended family had tried to sell it twice, but both potential buyers had backed out after learning the property's history. Local superstition had filled the vacuum left by rational explanation, and stories had grown in the telling. Some claimed to have seen lights in the windows on winter nights. Others swore they'd heard children's laughter echoing from the empty rooms. Jeremiah knew all about the stories because he'd been there that night. Not in the cabin, but close enough. He'd been running his trap lines in the early morning hours when he'd found the family's car stuck in a snowdrift about a mile down from the cabin. The engine was still warm, suggesting they'd only recently abandoned it in favor of walking the rest of the way. He'd followed their tracks in the snow, intending to offer assistance, but had arrived too late to change anything. What he'd found had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. The peaceful expressions on their faces had haunted him through 16 winters. The Christmas tree they'd never gotten to enjoy. The presents that would never be opened. The cruel irony that they'd died seeking the same solitude and peace that had drawn him to these mountains. He'd been the one to alert the authorities, though he'd slipped away before the investigation began in earnest. Mountain men and law enforcement had a complicated relationship, and Jeremiah had learned long ago that sometimes the best help you could offer was staying out of the way. But he'd never forgotten. The weathered photograph in his pocket was one of several he'd found scattered in the snow near their abandoned car. Family pictures that had fallen from Marie Henderson's purse. He'd kept them safe all these years, telling himself that someday he'd find a way to return them to relatives. In truth, they'd become a kind of talisman, a reminder that life was precious and fragile, and that some tragedies demanded a response beyond simply forgetting. Now, standing before the ruined cabin with Duke at his side, Jeremiah understood what that response was meant to be. The townspeople might call the place cursed, but he saw something different. He saw a family home that deserved better than neglect and superstition. He saw a chance to honor the memory of 4 people who died seeking the same peace these mountains had given him for most of his adult life. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist and revealing the full extent of the work ahead. The foundation was solid. Tom Henderson had built well, even if he'd trusted the wrong heating contractor. The basic structure was sound, despite the cosmetic decay. With patience and skill, it could be restored. Jeremiah set down his coffee cup and pulled on his work gloves. Duke settled into a patch of sunlight near the porch, maintaining his watch while remaining close enough to offer wordless encouragement. The first board came away easily, revealing the rot beneath. But as Jeremiah worked, pulling away the damaged wood and assessing what could be salvaged, he began to see past the decay to the craftsmanship underneath. Tom Henderson had been a good architect, and his love for this place showed in every carefully fitted joint and thoughtfully placed beam. "We'll bring you back," Jeremiah said quietly, addressing the cabin as much as the family who died within it. "Won't be exactly the same, but it'll be worthy of what you were meant to be." The work began in earnest, and with it, the slow process of healing that Jeremiah hadn't realized he'd been seeking all along. The discovery came on the third day of restoration, when Jeremiah was clearing debris from what had once been the children's bedroom. He'd been working methodically, salvaging what he could and cataloging the damage, when his crowbar caught something solid behind the rotted baseboard. What emerged was a small wooden box, hand-carved and still remarkably preserved despite the years of moisture and neglect. Duke's ears pricked forward as Jeremiah knelt in the filtered sunlight streaming through the damaged roof. The box was beautiful work, clearly handmade, with delicate roses carved into the lid and small brass hinges that still functioned smoothly. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from the elements, were letters. Not just any letters, love letters, dozens of them, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was cream-colored and heavy, the kind that spoke of deliberate care in its selection. The handwriting was elegant, flowing in the practiced script of someone who believed words deserved to be beautiful as well as meaningful. "My dearest Marie," began the topmost letter. "Dated 3 months before the tragedy. The cabin is everything we dreamed it would be. Tom has been working from sunrise to sunset, and I've never seen him happier. The children wake each morning asking when we can move to the mountains permanently. Perhaps someday we will." Jeremiah's hands trembled slightly as he read, understanding that he was holding someone's most private thoughts. These weren't the kind of letters that got written anymore. Lengthy, thoughtful correspondences that revealed the writer's soul. They were from Marie to her sister in California. Chronicles of the family's growing love affair with the mountains and their dreams of making the cabin their permanent home. Each letter painted a picture of a family finding their way to something precious. Tom's architecture practice was thriving, but he'd grown tired of designing sterile office buildings. He dreamed of specializing in mountain retreats, places where families could reconnect with each other and with the natural world. Marie wrote about teaching Emma to identify wildflowers and helping Michael overcome his fear of the dark by showing him how beautiful the night sky could be away from city lights. "The silence here isn't empty," one letter read. "It's full of wind in the pines, creek water over stones, and the kind of peace that makes you remember what really matters. Tom jokes that we're becoming mountain people, but I think we're just becoming ourselves." The final letter was dated 2 weeks before they died. "We've decided to spend Christmas here instead of flying back to visit family. I know Mother will be disappointed, but something about this place demands to be celebrated. Tom is installing a new heating system. He's been concerned about the old one. Says he wants everything perfect for our first real Christmas in the mountains. The children are so excited they can barely sleep." Jeremiah sat back on his heels, the letters resting in his lap like sacred texts. The irony was crushing. Tom Henderson had indeed installed a new heating system, but something had gone wrong. The very improvement meant to make their dream Christmas possible had become the instrument of their tragedy. But there was more in the box. Beneath the letters, wrapped in a separate piece of oilcloth, was a leather journal filled with Marie's handwriting. Unlike the letters, which had been meant for her sister, this journal contained her most private thoughts about their mountain life. Sketches of wildflowers filled the margins, and pressed leaves had been carefully taped to several pages. One entry, dated just days before the tragedy, stopped Jeremiah cold. There's something magical about this place. Not supernatural, but something deeper. Tom laughs when I say it, but I swear the mountains are trying to tell us something. Maybe it's just that we belong here. The children certainly think so. Yesterday, Emma said she wished we could stay forever. Forever and ever, she said, like the mountains do, out of the mouths of babes. The journal went on to describe their plans for the future. Tom had been secretly researching local building codes and talking to contractors about expanding the cabin. Marie had inquired about teaching opportunities in nearby communities. They'd been laying groundwork for a complete life change, trading urban success for mountain contentment. We've found our place in the world, she'd written. Now we just need the courage to claim it fully. The discovery hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. These weren't just victims of a tragic accident. They were kindred spirits, people who'd understood what the mountains offered to those brave enough to listen. They'd been on the verge of making the same choice he'd made decades earlier, choosing wilderness over convenience, solitude over society, authenticity over expectation. Duke whined softly, sensing his master's distress. Jeremiah reached out to stroke the dog's head, needing the connection to something living and present. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows through the damaged roof, and he realized he'd been reading for over an hour, carefully. He rewrapped the letters and journal, placing them back in their wooden sanctuary. But as he prepared to close the lid, his fingers found one more item tucked into a corner of the box, a small, tarnished silver locket. Inside was a photograph of the entire Henderson family, all four of them laughing at something outside the camera's range. They looked genuinely happy, the kind of happiness that comes from being exactly where you want to be with exactly the right people. The image perfectly matched one of the photographs he'd been carrying in his pocket for 16 years. The realization staggered him. He pulled out his own weathered photographs, comparing them to the image in the locket. Same family, same joy, but captured at different moments. The pictures he'd found in the snow weren't random snapshots. They were part of a larger collection. Precious memories that Marie Henderson had been carrying when they'd abandoned their car in the storm. She'd been bringing them to the cabin, probably planning to display them during their Christmas celebration. Instead, they'd been scattered in the snow, lost to winter and weather, all except the few that he'd salvaged and protected without understanding their true significance. For 16 years, he'd been the guardian of this family's memories, carrying their joy and dreams without knowing the full story. Now, surrounded by the ruins of their intended paradise, he understood that fate had made him something more than a witness to their tragedy. He'd become the keeper of their hopes, the protector of their dreams, and perhaps the only person capable of completing what they'd started. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like fresh snow. This wasn't just about restoring a cabin anymore. It was about honoring a vision, completing a journey that death had interrupted, and proving that some dreams are too precious to let die with their dreamers. As evening approached, Jeremiah packed away his tools and prepared to make camp. Tomorrow, he would resume the physical work of restoration. But tonight, he needed to plan something much more complex, how to rebuild not just a structure, but a testament to the power of finding your place in the world. Duke stretched and moved closer to the fire Jeremiah was building, his presence a reminder that some bonds transcend tragedy. The mountains themselves seemed to be listening, the evening wind carrying whispers through the pines that sounded almost like approval. In the growing darkness, the restored cabin existed only in Jeremiah's imagination and in the dreams of 4 people who would never see it completed. But sometimes, he was learning, the most important work begins with honoring the vision of others, even when, especially when, they can no longer see it through themselves. The letters had changed everything. What began as a simple restoration project had become a sacred trust, and Jeremiah Pike had never been one to walk away from a responsibility once he understood its true nature. The real work was just beginning. Word of Jeremiah's project spread through Millfield like smoke from a greenwood fire, slow at first, then filling every corner where people gathered to share news and speculation. By the end of the first week, Sarah McKinnon's general store had become an unofficial information exchange, with locals dropping by less for supplies than for updates on the mountain man's inexplicable mission. "Saw him hauling lumber up there yesterday," reported Clayton Morse, a retired logger whose arthritic hands still bore the scars of 40 years working the mountain forests. "Good quality pine, too. Not the cheap stuff you'd use for a quick patch job." Sarah nodded knowingly as she rang up his coffee and cigarettes. Clayton had an eye for timber that came from decades of selecting trees for harvest, and his approval carried weight among the local men who understood the difference between doing something and doing something right. "He's got a plan." "Oh, that's for certain," added Frank from behind the counter, where he was updating inventory ledgers with the methodical precision of a man who'd kept the same books for 30 years. "Asked me about special ordering some hardware. Specific stuff, reproduction hinges and period-appropriate door handles. That's not repair work, that's restoration." The distinction mattered in a town where most folks could appreciate the difference between fixing something broken and bringing something beautiful back to life. Millfield had seen its share of both over the years, and the community had developed strong opinions about which approach deserved respect. But not everyone approved of Jeremiah's efforts. Ruth Hendricks, who cleaned the Methodist Church and considered herself the unofficial guardian of the community's moral well-being, had made her feelings known to anyone who'd listen. "Some places ought to stay disturbed," she'd announced during Tuesday's quilting circle, her needle punching through fabric with unnecessary force. "That cabin's got sorrow in its bones. Stirring it up won't bring anybody back, and it might just invite more trouble." Her sentiment found support among some of the older residents, those who remembered the weeks following the Henderson tragedy when the entire town had seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Tragedy had a way of traveling in packs, they believed, and disturbing one sorrow might awaken others. Yet even Ruth's concerns carried an undertone of curiosity. Whatever people felt about the wisdom of Jeremiah's project, they couldn't deny being fascinated by it. The mountain man had always been a figure on the periphery of their community, reliable, respected, but essentially unknowable. Now he'd stepped into the center of their attention, and his motivations remained as mysterious as ever. The mystery deepened when Tommy McKinnon, Sarah and Frank's grandson, came running into the store on Thursday afternoon with news that set tongues wagging for days. "Grandpa, you gotta come see what Mr. Pike's doing up there." Tommy was 11 years old and possessed the kind of restless energy that made sitting still a physical impossibility. He'd been exploring the old mining trails when curiosity had drawn him closer to the Henderson place than his parents would have approved of. But his discovery was too important for worrying about boundaries. "He's not just fixing it," Tommy explained breathlessly. "He's making it beautiful, like really beautiful. And he's got drawings." The drawings, as Tommy described them, were detailed architectural sketches spread across a makeshift table Jeremiah had constructed from sawhorses and plywood. They showed the cabin not as it was, but as it could become, every room carefully planned, every detail considered, every improvement designed to enhance rather than replace the original vision. They looked like real blueprints, Tommy insisted. Professional ones like Dad uses for his contracting jobs. But these were all hand-drawn, and there were notes written all over them about keeping the family feeling and making sure the kids' room gets the best morning light. The implications were staggering. Jeremiah wasn't just restoring the Henderson cabin, he was completing it, bringing to life the expansion plans that Tom Henderson had never gotten the chance to implement. Somehow, the mountain man had divined not just the family's dreams, but the specific details of how they'd hoped to make those dreams reality. Sarah found herself walking up the old logging road that evening, ostensibly to deliver some supplies that Jeremiah had requested, but really to satisfy her own curiosity. She'd known this country for 60 years, had seen it through boom times and bust, through seasons of plenty and winters that tested everyone's resolve. But she'd never seen anything quite like what she found at the Henderson place. Jeremiah had worked methodically, section by section, removing damaged materials while carefully preserving anything that could be saved. The original logs had been cleaned and treated, revealing the warm honey color of properly seasoned pine. Windows had been measured and marked for replacement, but the frames would be rebuilt to match the original proportions exactly. Most impressive were the small details that spoke to genuine care. Where Tom Henderson had carved his family's initials into a porch beam, Jeremiah had carefully worked around them, reinforcing the wood without disturbing the memorial. A child's handprint in what had once been wet concrete was now protected under a carefully constructed overhang. "Didn't expect visitors," Jeremiah said quietly, not looking up from the window frame he was sanding. Duke raised his head from where he'd been dozing in the afternoon sun, but didn't bother to stand. Sarah had brought him treats often enough over the years to qualify as a friend. "Brought your hardware?" Sarah replied, setting down a box of hinges and handles. "Came in faster than I expected." She stood quietly for a moment, watching him work. Jeremiah's hands moved with the confidence of long practice, but there was something different about the way he approached this project. Every motion seemed deliberate, respectful, as if he understood that he was handling something sacred. "They had plans, didn't they?" Sarah asked finally. "The Hendersons." "Plans for this place?" Jeremiah paused in his sanding, considering his response. Sarah McKinnon had earned the right to straight answers through decades of fair dealing and genuine kindness. She wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. She was trying to understand something important. "They did," he confirmed. "Found some of their letters. They loved this place, had dreams for it. Seemed wrong to let those dreams die with them." Sarah nodded, understanding more than he'd actually said. In a community where everyone had learned to read between the lines, Jeremiah's simple statement carried volumes of meaning. He wasn't just building a cabin, he was completing a love story, honoring a family's vision, proving that some dreams are too precious to abandon to tragedy. As she walked back toward town in the gathering dusk, Sarah found herself thinking about the difference between haunted places and sacred ones. The Henderson cabin had been haunted by sorrow and fear, avoided because it reminded people of life's fragility. But under Jeremiah's patient hands, it was becoming something different, a testament to the power of love to transcend loss, a proof that beauty could emerge from tragedy if someone cared enough to nurture it. The transformation wasn't just happening to the cabin. It was happening to everyone who witnessed it, including Sarah herself. The first real challenge came with the foundation work, when Jeremiah discovered that the tragedy had left more than emotional scars. Years of water damage from the compromised roof had weakened several support beams, creating structural problems that couldn't be solved with simple repairs. Standing in the cabin's dim interior, flashlight beam revealing the extent of the rot, he faced the kind of setback that had defeated lesser projects, but tucked inside Marie Henderson's journal, he'd found something that changed everything: detailed sketches of Tom's original foundation reinforcement plans. The architect had been concerned about long-term stability in the mountain environment and had designed an elegant system of supplemental supports that would have strengthened the entire structure. He'd never gotten the chance to implement the improvements, but his careful drawings provided a roadmap for exactly the repairs Jeremiah now needed to make. It was as if Tom Henderson was reaching across 16 years of silence to help complete his own vision. The work required skills that went beyond basic carpentry, and Jeremiah found himself drawing on knowledge accumulated over decades of mountain living. He'd built bridges across creeks, reinforced mining structures, and even helped raise a barn or two in his younger years. But this project demanded a level of precision that honored both the original craftsmanship and the architect's unfulfilled plans. Duke proved to be an invaluable assistant, his keen senses alerting Jeremiah to problems before they became dangerous. When a weakened beam shifted during removal, the dog's warning bark came seconds before the timber would have crashed down. When Jeremiah needed to level a support post, Duke seemed to understand exactly which tool to nudge closer with his nose. "Getting pretty good at this construction work," Jeremiah told his companion during a water break. "Maybe we should hire ourselves out." Duke's response was a look that clearly suggested he preferred their usual, solitary lifestyle. But he remained dutifully at his post, watching the forest approaches while Jeremiah worked. The complexity of the repairs meant longer days at the cabin, and Jeremiah began making overnight camps rather than returning to his own place each evening. He'd pitched a military surplus tent near the clearing's edge, positioned to catch the morning sun, but sheltered from the afternoon winds that could turn fierce without warning. The arrangement felt temporary and permanent at the same time, as if he was settling in for a job that might take the rest of his life. Word of his commitment reached Millfield through Tommy McKinnon, who'd become an unofficial chronicler of the project's progress. The boy's daily reports to his grandparents had evolved into detailed accounts of not just what Jeremiah was building, but how he was building it. "He talks to the cabin," Tommy reported one afternoon, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone children use for observations that adults might find strange. "Like he's asking permission before he changes anything. And he's got a notebook where he writes down everything he finds. Old nails, pieces of the original chinking, even splinters that have carved initials in them." Sarah listened to these reports with growing fascination. Tommy's descriptions painted a picture of someone approaching the restoration with the reverence of a historian and the care of a curator. Jeremiah wasn't just rebuilding a structure, he was preserving a story, protecting every detail that connected the present work to the family who'd loved this place. The notebook Tommy mentioned was actually a leather-bound journal that had belonged to Jeremiah's father. A man who taught his son that important work deserved careful documentation. Each page now contained sketches, measurements, and observations about the Henderson cabin's construction. But more than technical details, the journal captured Jeremiah's growing understanding of the family whose dreams he was bringing to life. "T.H. carved his initials inside the pantry door," read one entry. "Hidden where only family would see. Below it, smaller letters, for M and the children, with all my love." This was a man who understood that the most important messages are the ones meant for the people closest to your heart. Another entry documented a different kind of discovery. "Found Emma's art supplies in the closet. Crayons and drawing paper, water-damaged but still recognizable. She was drawing flowers over and over. Marie wrote about teaching her to identify wildflowers. The child was learning to see beauty the way her mother did." These personal artifacts were accumulating in a wooden crate Jeremiah had built specifically for their preservation. Unlike the letters and journal he'd found in the hidden box, these items had been scattered throughout the cabin by years of weather and neglect. Each discovery felt like finding pieces of a puzzle that would never be complete, but grew more meaningful with every recovered fragment. The work itself was progressing faster than Jeremiah had expected, partly because Tom Henderson's original construction had been so well planned. The architect had built with an understanding of mountain conditions, selecting materials and techniques that would withstand extreme weather and seasonal movement. Where other buildings might have failed completely under such neglect, the Henderson cabin had endured, waiting for someone who understood its value. But the project's success was creating its own problems. As word spread beyond Millfield, curiosity seekers began appearing on the old logging road. Most were respectful, content to observe from a distance. But others seemed to view the restoration as entertainment, a spectacle to be photographed and shared on social media. Jeremiah had little patience for gawkers, especially those who treated the tragedy's aftermath as a curiosity. When a group of teenagers arrived with cameras and loud voices, intent on creating content about the cursed cabin, Duke's low growl and Jeremiah's steely stare sent them retreating faster than they'd arrived. "This ain't a tourist attraction," he'd told Sarah when she'd stopped by with supplies the next day. "It's a memorial. People need to understand the difference." Sarah had nodded, understanding that the project's growing visibility was creating challenges Jeremiah hadn't anticipated. A man accustomed to solitude and privacy was suddenly finding himself at the center of community attention. And not all of it was welcome, yet there were moments when the attention brought unexpected gifts. Dr. Patricia Valdez, the town's physician, had stopped by to offer medical supplies for Jeremiah's first aid kit, but had stayed to examine the cabin's restoration with professional interest. As someone who'd treated the mining injuries and mountain accidents that were part of life in Millfield, she understood the difference between careful work and reckless shortcuts. "This is remarkable craftsmanship," she'd told him, running her hand along a perfectly fitted joint. "You're not just rebuilding, you're improving on the original design." Tom Henderson would be proud. It was exactly the kind of recognition Jeremiah hadn't realized he'd been seeking, and it came from someone whose opinion he'd learned to respect during his infrequent trips to town for medical attention. The validation meant more than he'd expected, confirming that his efforts were worthy of the trust the Henderson family had unknowingly placed in him. The first snow arrived 3 weeks earlier than usual, dusting the pine boughs with crystalline warnings of the harsh months ahead. Jeremiah stood on the partially rebuilt porch, watching fat flakes drift through the afternoon air, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with approaching winter. He'd lived through enough mountain seasons to read the signs. This was going to be a hard one, the kind that tested both preparation and resolve. Inside his tent that evening, he spread Tom Henderson's architectural drawings across his sleeping bag and studied them by lamplight. The expansion plans were ambitious, designed to transform the modest cabin into a true mountain home that could comfortably shelter a family through any weather. But the approaching winter meant difficult choices about which improvements were essential and which would have to wait for spring. The heating system took priority. Jeremiah had already identified the flaw in the installation that had killed the Henderson family, a cracked heat exchanger that had leaked carbon monoxide into the living spaces. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him that Tom's attempt to improve their safety had become the instrument of their death. This time, there would be no mistakes. Working by the light of battery-powered lanterns, Jeremiah began the delicate process of installing a new system based on Tom's original specifications, but updated with modern safety features. He'd ordered the components through Sarah's store, each piece carefully researched to ensure compatibility with both the cabin's vintage charm and contemporary safety standards. The work required precision that went beyond carpentry skills, demanding an understanding of airflow, combustion, and the deadly mathematics of gas concentrations. Duke watched from his position near the door, alert to the subtle changes in his master's demeanor that indicated particularly dangerous work. The dog had learned to recognize the difference between routine construction tasks and moments when absolute concentration was required. During those times, he maintained a vigilant silence, ready to alert Jeremiah to any distraction that might prove costly. The complexity of the heating installation meant calling on skills Jeremiah had developed during his years of maintaining his own remote cabin. Living beyond the reach of utility companies had taught him to become a jack of all trades, capable of electrical work, plumbing, and mechanical repairs that most people would leave to specialists. But this project carried emotional weight that made every connection feel critical. As he worked, Jeremiah found himself talking to the cabin, carrying on one-sided conversations that would have seemed strange to outside observers, but felt perfectly natural in the isolation of the mountains. "Tom knew what he was doing with this design," he murmured, while fitting a new thermostat. "Just got some bad advice from the contractor. Won't happen this time, I promise you that." The promise felt like a sacred vow, binding him not just to technical excellence, but to the redemption of a family's truncated dreams. Every properly seated gasket, every correctly calibrated valve, became an act of memorial and prevention, ensuring that the tragedy that had claimed the Hendersons would never be repeated. The heating work revealed another artifact that would reshape Jeremiah's understanding of the family he was honoring. Hidden behind the old furnace, wrapped in plastic and tucked into a cavity that only someone removing the unit would ever find, was a metal box containing Tom Henderson's personal papers, insurance documents, architectural licenses, and a leather portfolio filled with sketches of mountain homes he'd designed but never built. Each drawing represented a dream unrealized, a family's vision of perfect mountain living that had been interrupted by death. But more than that, they revealed Tom Henderson as an artist whose medium was shelter, a man who understood that homes were more than structures. They were the physical manifestation of love, security, and belonging. One sketch in particular caught Jeremiah's attention. It showed the Henderson cabin as Tom had envisioned its final form, complete with the expansion that would have added a master suite, a proper workshop, and a sun-filled studio where Marie could have taught music lessons to local children. The drawing was labeled "Forever Home" in Tom's careful architectural lettering, with a note that read, "For Marie and the kids, because some dreams are worth building to last." The discovery hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. He'd been working to honor the memory of a family, but now he understood that he was also completing the professional legacy of a kindred spirit. Tom Henderson hadn't just been an architect who happened to love the mountains. He'd been a man, trying to create something permanent and beautiful in a world that seemed increasingly temporary and hollow. As evening approached and the snow continued to fall, Jeremiah made a decision that would have seemed impossible when he'd first arrived at the abandoned cabin. He wasn't just going to restore the Henderson home. He was going to build Tom's complete vision, finishing the work that death had interrupted and creating the forever home that the family had never gotten to enjoy. The commitment was staggering in its scope and implications. Completing Tom's plans would require months of additional work, specialized materials, and skills that would push Jeremiah beyond anything he'd previously attempted. But as he studied the drawings by lamplight, with Duke curled beside him and snow tapping against the tent walls, he felt a certainty that transcended practical considerations. This was what the mountain had been trying to tell him during all those years of solitary living. This was the purpose his life had been preparing him for. Not just survival in the wilderness, but the creation of something meaningful, something that honored both the dead and the living, something that proved love could triumph over loss if someone cared enough to complete the work. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with 6 inches of fresh snow transforming the clearing into a pristine landscape that seemed to encourage bold decisions. Jeremiah built up the fire in his camp stove and spread Tom's drawings on the makeshift table, studying them with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. Duke stretched and padded over to investigate, his breath creating small puffs of vapor in the crisp air. The dog had grown comfortable with their extended residence at the cabin, establishing patrol routes through the surrounding forest and claiming a favorite sleeping spot on the partially completed porch. "What do you think, partner?" Jeremiah asked, gesturing toward the architectural drawings. "Ready to take on something that might just change everything?" Duke's tail wagged once, which Jeremiah had learned to interpret as cautious approval mixed with complete loyalty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as they had faced everything else in their partnership. The real work was about to begin. The first real test of Jeremiah's resolve came not from the elements, but from an unexpected visit that arrived with the December wind. He was working on the foundation for Tom's planned workshop extension when he heard an unfamiliar engine laboring up the old logging road. Duke's alerting bark brought him to the edge of the clearing, where he watched a black SUV with government plates negotiate the rutted track. 2 men emerged from the vehicle, their city clothes and official bearing immediately identifying them as the kind of visitors Jeremiah had spent most of his adult life avoiding. The older man, gray-haired and wearing a badge that caught the winter sunlight, introduced himself as Detective Ray Morrison from the Colorado State Police. His companion was younger, carrying a briefcase and the nervous energy of someone unaccustomed to mountain terrain. "Mr. Pike," Detective Morrison began, his tone carefully neutral, "we need to ask you some questions about your activities here." Jeremiah set down his tools and wiped his hands on a rag, buying time to assess the situation. In his experience, official visitors rarely brought good news, and their timing suggested this wasn't a routine inquiry. "Questions about what?" he replied, keeping his voice level. The younger man, who'd introduced himself as Agent Stevens from the State Insurance Fraud Division, spoke up. "We've received reports about unauthorized construction on this property. The Henderson estate still owns this land, and there's been no permit issued for the work you're doing here." The accusation hung in the cold air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Jeremiah felt Duke move closer to his side, the dog's presence a reminder that some partnerships transcended legal complications. "Nobody asked me to stop," Jeremiah said quietly. "Nobody's been up here in 16 years. Detective Morrison pulled out a notebook, his movement suggesting this was more than a casual inquiry. "That's what we're trying to understand, Mr. Pike. Why this property? Why now? And where are you getting the money for materials and specialized equipment?" The questions revealed the real concern. Someone had reported not just unauthorized construction, but suspicious financial activity. In the post-9/11 world, where cash transactions and off-grid living automatically triggered government interest, Jeremiah's project had apparently crossed someone's threshold of concern. Agent Stevens opened his briefcase and retrieved a folder thick with photographs. "We've been monitoring this site for 3 weeks, Mr. Pike. You've brought in thousands of dollars worth of materials, all paid for in cash. You're working from professional architectural drawings, and you've installed heating equipment that requires specialized knowledge. We need to understand your connection to this property and the source of your funding." Jeremiah studied the photographs, long lens shots of him working, close-ups of material deliveries, even images of Tom Henderson's drawings spread across his makeshift table. Someone had been watching him with the thoroughness of a surveillance operation. "Who's asking?" he said finally. Detective Morrison exchanged glances with his partner before answering. "The Henderson family, or what's left of it." Marie Henderson had a sister in California who inherited the property. "She's been trying to sell it for years, and your improvements are complicating potential transactions. She wants to know what you're doing here and whether you have any legal claim to the land." The revelation hit Jeremiah harder than he'd expected. Somewhere in California, Marie Henderson's sister was dealing with lawyers and real estate agents, trying to turn her family's tragedy into a concluded transaction. The cabin that represented love and dreams to Jeremiah was just a problematic asset to someone who'd never seen its potential, but more troubling was the realization that his project had attracted official attention. Living off the grid required a delicate balance between independence and invisibility, and Jeremiah had apparently tipped too far toward the visible side of that equation. Agent Stevens consulted his notes. "Your cash purchases have triggered multiple reporting requirements, Mr. Pike. Hardware stores, lumber yards, specialty contractors, they're all required to report large cash transactions. Combined with your presence on property you don't own, it's created a pattern that demands investigation." Jeremiah reached into his jacket and withdrew the leather folder containing Marie Henderson's letters. "Found these inside the cabin," he said, handing the folder to Detective Morrison. "Thought you might want to read them before you decide I'm doing something wrong." The detective opened the folder and began reading, his expression shifting from official skepticism to something approaching understanding. Agent Stevens looked over his shoulder, and both men grew quiet as they absorbed Marie's words about dreams, family, and finding their place in the mountains. "These are—" Detective Morrison paused, clearly affected by what he was reading. "These are beautiful, personal, but they don't establish your right to be here, Mr. Pike. Don't establish my right to abandon them either," Jeremiah replied. "These people loved this place. They died trying to make it their home. Seemed wrong to let their dreams rot along with the timbers. Agent Stevens was studying Tom Henderson's architectural drawings, his trained eye recognizing the professional quality of the work. These are detailed expansion plans. Professional grade. Where did you get them? Found them hidden in the old heating system, Jeremiah explained. Tom Henderson drew them himself. He was planning to complete this work before. He let the sentence hang unfinished. The two officials spent another hour at the cabin, examining Jeremiah's documentation, questioning his methods, and trying to fit his project into categories their training had prepared them to understand. But how do you classify a memorial built by a stranger who'd carried photographs of a dead family for 16 years? How do you investigate someone whose only crime was caring too much about completing someone else's dreams? Finally, Detective Morrison closed his notebook. Mr. Pike, I'm not going to arrest you today, but you need to understand that this situation can't continue indefinitely. The property has an owner, and she has rights that supersede your good intentions. Agent Stevens added his own warning. And your cash transactions are going to continue drawing attention. We live in a world where financial privacy is a luxury most people can't afford. After they left, Jeremiah sat on the partially completed porch with Duke beside him, watching their vehicle disappear down the mountain road. The visit had changed nothing about his commitment to the project, but it had clarified the stakes. Time was no longer unlimited, and his work had attracted attention from forces beyond his control. That evening he wrote his first entry in weeks in his documentation journal. Government men came today. They see problems where I see purpose, complications where I see completion. Marie's sister wants to sell, which means someone else will decide this place's future. Have to work faster now. Have to finish what I promised before lawyers and bureaucrats turn dreams back into real estate. The race against official interference had begun. And Jeremiah understood that completing Tom Henderson's vision would require more than skill and determination. It would require beating a system designed to prevent exactly the kind of unauthorized love that had brought him to this mountain in the first place. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, carried up the mountain by Sarah McKinnon herself instead of being left at the general store. Jeremiah was installing the last of the custom windows when he saw her climbing the logging road, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air and her expression unreadable. "This came to the store addressed to you," she said without preamble, holding out an envelope with California postmark and the kind of heavy paper that suggested legal correspondence. "Figured it was important enough to bring up personal." Jeremiah wiped his hands on his work shirt and accepted the envelope, noting the return address. Catherine Valdez, attorney at law, San Francisco. The name meant nothing to him, but Sarah's presence suggested she understood its significance better than he did. "Catherine Valdez," Sarah said quietly. "That's Marie Henderson's maiden name." Her sister. The revelation stopped Jeremiah cold. Marie's sister wasn't just the property owner who wanted to sell. She was Dr. Patricia Valdez's relative, the town physician who'd praised his craftsmanship and offered medical supplies, was connected to the family whose dreams he was trying to complete. With Duke pressing against his leg, Jeremiah opened the envelope and read the letter that would change everything he thought he understood about his mission. "Mr. Pike," it began, "I am Catherine Valdez, legal guardian of the Henderson property and sister to Marie Henderson, who died with her family 16 years ago. My cousin, Dr. Patricia Valdez of Millfield, has informed me of your extraordinary work restoring my sister's cabin. She has also provided me with photographs of your progress and descriptions of the care you're taking to honor my family's memory. I'm writing to propose a meeting that I believe will be of interest to both of us." Jeremiah looked up from the letter to find Sarah watching him intently. "You knew about this," he said. "Patricia called her cousin after she visited your project," Sarah admitted. "Catherine's been trying to figure out what to do with that property for years. She couldn't bear to visit, couldn't bring herself to sell, couldn't decide whether to tear it down or let it rot. When Patricia told her what you were doing, she gestured for Jeremiah to continue reading. The letter's next paragraph contained information that reframed everything he thought he knew about the Henderson family's legacy. What you may not know, Mr. Pike, is that Marie and Tom died intestate without a will, but they did leave behind something of great value. In the months before their deaths, Tom had been documenting his architectural vision for mountain living through detailed drawings, specifications, and a comprehensive guide he hoped to publish as The Mountain Home, a guide to building with love and permanence. The manuscript was nearly complete when they died, and it has been stored in my San Francisco office for 16 years, waiting for someone who could understand its value. Jeremiah's hands trembled slightly as he absorbed the implications. Tom Henderson hadn't just been planning to expand his own cabin. He'd been developing a comprehensive philosophy of mountain architecture, a guide that would help other families create their own perfect retreats. The work Jeremiah was completing wasn't just one man's dream, but the foundation of a larger vision that could help countless others. The letter continued, Patricia has shown me photographs of your work, Mr. Pike, and I believe you may be the person Tom was writing for, someone who understands that homes are built with more than lumber and nails, someone who appreciates that the best construction combines technical skill with emotional intelligence. If you are willing, I would like to meet with you to discuss completing not just the cabin, but Tom's entire legacy. Sarah had been reading over his shoulder, and she stepped back when he finished the letter.
She's coming here, isn't she?
Jeremiah checked the letter's final paragraph, which confirmed Sarah's suspicion. She's driving up from Colorado Springs tomorrow, wants to see the cabin and discuss what she calls a partnership that could honor both Tom's vision and your evident dedication to seeing it completed. The implications were staggering. Catherine Valdez wasn't just Marie's sister. She was a lawyer who'd been preserving her brother-in-law's work for 16 years, waiting for someone who could bring it to life. The surveillance and official pressure that had seemed so threatening now appeared to be part of a larger plan, a way of verifying that the mysterious mountain man working on the Henderson property was someone worth trusting with a valuable legacy. That evening, as snow began falling again, Jeremiah sat in his tent reading Tom Henderson's letters to his publisher, which Catherine had included with her correspondence. The architect's vision had been remarkably prescient, anticipating trends in sustainable living and remote work that wouldn't become mainstream for another decade. The mountains don't just offer escape from urban life, Tom had written. They offer a chance to build better lives, more intentional lives, lives that honor both human needs and natural systems. Every home we build in the wilderness should be a testament to the possibility of harmony between human ambition and environmental stewardship. Duke lay beside him, occasionally lifting his head when wind rattled the tent walls, but otherwise content to provide warm companionship while Jeremiah absorbed the magnitude of what he'd stumbled into. What had begun as a simple restoration project driven by guilt and respect had evolved into something much larger, the completion of a visionary's work, the preservation of ideas that could influence how people thought about living in harmony with wild places. The real shock came in Tom's final letter to his editor, dated just weeks before the family's death. "I've found my test case, the perfect example of everything I've been trying to articulate about mountain architecture. Our cabin will be the centerpiece of the book, not because it's grand, but because it represents what happens when technical skill meets genuine love for place. Marie and the children understand what I'm trying to create here. They see the cabin not as shelter from the wilderness, but as a bridge between human comfort and natural beauty." Jeremiah set down the letter and stared into the lamp's flickering flame. Tom Henderson had intended his own cabin to be the proof of concept for his architectural philosophy, the lived example that would demonstrate the principles he was trying to share. By completing the restoration, Jeremiah wasn't just honoring one family's dreams, he was bringing to life the foundational example of a movement that could change how people approached building in wild places. The weight of that responsibility was both inspiring and terrifying. Catherine Valdez's arrival would determine whether he was capable of carrying forward a legacy much larger than he'd ever imagined, or whether the project would be transferred to professionals who understood publishing and promotion, but might not grasp the deeper principles that made Tom's vision special. As he prepared for sleep, Jeremiah found himself talking to the cabin again, but this time the conversation felt different. "Tomorrow we find out if this is really about you," he murmured, "or if you're just the beginning of something bigger than either of us imagined." Duke's contented sigh suggested the dog had confidence in whatever lay ahead, but Jeremiah spent much of the night staring at the tent's ceiling, wondering if he was ready to become not just the restorer of one family's dreams, but the guardian of ideas that could influence generations of people seeking to build meaningful lives in the mountains he'd called home for so long. The morning would bring answers, and with them a new understanding of why fate had led him to this abandoned cabin where love and tragedy had left their mark on both the land and the heart of a solitary man who'd never expected to become the keeper of someone else's legacy. Catherine Valdez arrived at dawn, her rental car navigating the treacherous mountain road with the careful precision of someone unaccustomed to snow-covered terrain, but determined not to let inexperience defeat her mission. Jeremiah watched from the cabin's completed porch as she parked beside his weathered truck, noting how she sat motionless for several minutes before emerging, as if gathering courage for a confrontation she'd been avoiding for 16 years. She was older than he'd expected, perhaps in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of purposeful clothing that suggested someone who dressed for function rather than fashion. But her eyes held the same intelligent warmth he remembered from the photograph in Marie's locket, and when she looked at the restored cabin, her expression carried a mixture of grief and wonder that needed no translation. "You must be Jeremiah," she said, her voice carrying only the slightest tremor. "I'm Catherine." "Kate, really?" "Only lawyers call me Catherine." Duke approached cautiously, his usual wariness of strangers tempered by something in Kate's demeanor that suggested trustworthiness. When she extended her hand for him to sniff, then scratched behind his ears with the confidence of someone familiar with dogs, Jeremiah felt his own guardedness begin to ease. "Beautiful work," Kate said, studying the cabin's exterior with the analytical eye of someone accustomed to evaluating complex projects. Patricia's photographs didn't do it justice. "You've managed to honor the original while improving on it. That's much harder than it sounds." She carried herself with the authority of someone used to being listened to, but there was nothing imperious about her presence. Instead, Jeremiah sensed a deep weariness, the burden of someone who'd been carrying responsibility for decisions she'd never wanted to make. "Would you like to see inside?" he offered. Kate nodded, though he noticed her hands trembling slightly as she climbed the porch steps. The interior restoration was nearly complete. Walls refinished, floors restored to their original luster, and windows positioned to frame views of the surrounding peaks. But more impressive than the craftsmanship was the attention to detail that honored the family's memory. Emma's height marks were carefully preserved on the kitchen doorframe. The living room furniture was arranged according to sketches found in Marie's journal. Even the children's artwork, painstakingly restored from water-damaged fragments, hung in frames positioned where loving parents would have displayed them. Kate moved through the rooms like someone revisiting a half-remembered dream, touching surfaces with the reverence reserved for relics. In what had been Emma and Michael's bedroom, she stopped before a small display case Jeremiah had built to house some of the family's recovered possessions. Crayons, a favorite book, a stuffed animal that had somehow survived the years. "Marie used to write about this place," Kate said quietly. Her letters were so full of joy, so excited about the life they were building. "I was jealous, actually. Living in San Francisco, working 80-hour weeks, watching her find this perfect balance between family and dreams. I thought she was naive about mountain living, thought the novelty would wear off. She paused beside the window, looking out at the clearing where Tom had planned his workshop. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. Jeremiah had prepared coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table where the Henderson family had shared their final meals. Kate opened the briefcase she'd brought, revealing manuscripts, drawings, and photographs that represented 16 years of preserved memories. Tom's book, she said, lifting out a thick sheaf of typed pages bound in leather covers. He'd been working on it for 3 years, corresponding with editors in New York, developing what he called a new philosophy of residential architecture for the American wilderness. The publishers were interested, but they wanted a completed example, a house that proved his theories actually worked. She gestured toward the restored cabin around them. This was going to be that example. He planned to photograph every stage of the expansion, document every decision, show how traditional building techniques could be adapted for modern families living in remote locations. The book was going to make him famous, establish him as the authority on mountain architecture. Jeremiah studied the manuscript's title page, The Mountain Home, Building with Love, Permanence and Respect for Place by Thomas J. Henderson, AIA. Below the title was a dedication for Marie and the children, who taught me that the most beautiful structures are the ones filled with laughter. What happened to the publishing deal? He asked. Kate's expression darkened. After they died, I was too grief-stricken to think about business matters. By the time I recovered enough to contact the publishers, they'd moved on to other projects. Mountain architecture wasn't trendy anymore, and without Tom's personal story to drive promotion, they weren't interested in an unfinished manuscript by a dead architect. She pulled out another folder, this one containing correspondence between herself and various publishers over the years. I've tried to revive interest several times, but the market has changed. Publishers want celebrity architects now, people with television shows and social media followings. Tom's ideas are still valuable, but his story isn't marketable without the completed example he was planning to create. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching on the mountain road. Through the kitchen window, Jeremiah could see a small convoy climbing toward the cabin, Sarah McKinnon's pickup truck, followed by 2 other vehicles he didn't recognize. I invited some people to join us, Kate explained, noting his concerned expression. I hope you don't mind, but this conversation affects more than just the 2 of us. The visitors included Sarah and Frank McKinnon, Dr. Patricia Valdez, and 2 men Jeremiah didn't recognize, one carrying surveying equipment, the other with the official bearing of someone accustomed to making important decisions. Kate made the introductions. This is James Crawford from the Colorado Historical Society, and Michael Torres, a documentary filmmaker from Denver. James is interested in the cabin's potential for historical designation, and Michael has a proposal I think you'll find intriguing. The group gathered in the cabin's living room, where the restored space provided a perfect backdrop for the conversation that would determine the project's future. James Crawford examined Jeremiah's documentation with the thoroughness of someone trained to evaluate historical significance, while Michael Torres studied the cabin's restoration with the eye of someone looking for compelling visual narratives. This is remarkable work, Crawford said, reviewing the photographs that chronicled the restoration process. You've essentially completed one of Colorado's most significant examples of early, sustainable architecture, and you've documented every step. From a preservation standpoint, this rivals anything we've seen in recent years. Torres was equally impressed, though his interest focused on different aspects of the project. The human story is extraordinary, he said. A solitary mountain man discovers a family's abandoned dreams and spends months bringing them to life, only to learn that he's completing work that could influence an entire movement of people seeking authentic relationships with wilderness. This isn't just a restoration story, it's a meditation on legacy, love, and the connections that transcend death. Kate had been listening to these assessments with growing excitement. And now she leaned forward to present her proposal. Here's what I'm thinking, Jeremiah. We complete Tom's book using your restoration as the centerpiece example. Michael documents the entire process, creating a film that shows both the technical aspects and the emotional journey. James helps us secure historical designation for the cabin, ensuring it's preserved as an example of visionary mountain architecture. And we establish a foundation that uses proceeds from the book and film to help other families create their own mountain homes using Tom's principles. The proposal was breathtaking in its scope and implications. What had begun as a private act of memorial would become a public celebration of vision and craftsmanship, a way of ensuring that Tom Henderson's ideas reached the audience he'd originally intended. But it also meant giving up the solitude and privacy that had drawn Jeremiah to the mountains in the first place. Success would bring attention visitors and the kind of scrutiny he'd spent decades avoiding. "I need time to think about this," he said finally. Kate nodded understandingly. "Of course, but I should mention one more thing." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a legal document. "I'm prepared to deed the property to you, Jeremiah. No strings attached. You've earned the right to decide this place's future." The offer hung in the winter air like a challenge. Everything Jeremiah had ever wanted was within reach. Ownership of the land he'd grown to love. The freedom to complete his work without interference. The satisfaction of seeing Tom Henderson's dreams fully realized. But accepting would also mean accepting responsibility for something much larger than himself. Becoming the guardian of ideas that could influence how people thought about living in harmony with wild places. The choice wasn't just about property, ownership. It was about whether he was willing to step out of the shadows and become the public face of someone else's vision. As evening approached and the visitors prepared to return to town, Jeremiah stood alone on the porch with Duke beside him, watching the sun set behind the peaks and trying to understand what the mountain was telling him about the decision that would define the rest of his life. The decision came at 3 a.m, when Jeremiah woke to find snow falling heavily enough to muffle all sound except his own breathing and Duke's steady heartbeat against his side. The tent felt smaller than usual, compressed by the weight of choices that seemed to expand with each hour of consideration. Through the canvas walls, he could sense the cabin waiting in the darkness, complete enough now to shelter a family, but still lacking the final details that would transform it from restoration to revelation. He'd spent the evening walking the property boundaries, following fence lines that Tom Henderson had marked 16 years earlier, and imagining the expanded vision that Kate Valdez's proposal would make possible. The workshop space was framed but not finished. The studio where Marie had dreamed of teaching music lessons existed only in architectural drawings. The master suite that would have given the couple privacy and comfort remained a foundation, waiting for walls. Duke stirred as Jeremiah sat up, the dog's amber eyes reflecting the small battery lantern that provided their only light. In the silence that mountain winters created, every decision seemed to echo with significance that couldn't be ignored or postponed. "What do you think, partner?" Jeremiah whispered, his breath creating small clouds in the tent's cold air. "Ready to become famous?" The question was meant as humor, but it carried the weight of genuine uncertainty. Fame had never been something Jeremiah sought or valued. His decades of mountain living had been built on the premise that the best life was lived away from public attention, finding meaning in work that satisfied personal standards rather than external expectations. But Tom Henderson's manuscript, which Jeremiah had spent hours studying by lamplight, argued for a different kind of relationship between private satisfaction and public responsibility. "The most beautiful buildings are selfish acts made generous," Tom had written. "We create them for our own families, our own dreams, our own vision of perfect living. But when we build with authentic love and genuine skill, the results transcend personal satisfaction and become gifts to everyone who encounters them." The philosophy resonated with something Jeremiah had been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. His restoration work had begun as a private act of memorial, but it had evolved into something that seemed to demand sharing. The townspeople who'd watched his progress, the officials who'd investigated his activities, even the casual visitors who'd been drawn by curiosity, all had responded to something more than impressive craftsmanship. They'd recognized authenticity, the rare quality that emerged when technical skill combined with genuine emotion. Rising from his sleeping bag, Jeremiah pulled on boots and a heavy jacket, then stepped out into the falling snow with Duke close beside him. The cabin stood silhouetted against the storm, its restored windows glowing faintly from the battery-powered lights he'd left burning inside. Even in the darkness, the building radiated the kind of welcoming warmth that Tom Henderson had designed it to express. Walking through the front door felt like entering a sacred space, not because of any supernatural presence, but because every surface represented hours of careful work, guided by love for people he'd never met. The kitchen where Marie had planned family meals. The living room where Emma and Michael would have played on snowy evenings. The bedrooms where parents and children would have shared the kind of security that comes from being exactly where you belong. But more than honoring the Henderson family's memory, the restoration had become proof of Tom's architectural philosophy. Every room demonstrated that homes could be both beautiful and functional, that traditional building techniques could create spaces perfectly adapted to modern family life, that the best residential design emerged from understanding the specific needs of specific people living in specific places. Jeremiah found himself standing in what would have been Tom's workshop, the space where the architect had planned to build furniture and develop prototypes for the building techniques he was documenting. The room was framed but unfinished, waiting for someone to complete the vision that death had interrupted. That's when he understood what his decision had to be. The choice wasn't between privacy and publicity, solitude and fame, or even personal satisfaction and public responsibility. The choice was between completing half a job and finishing what he'd started, between honoring Tom Henderson's memory and honoring Tom Henderson's vision, between protecting his own comfort and protecting ideas that could help other families find their way to the same kind of authentic mountain life the Hendersons had been seeking. Tom's manuscript wasn't just a book about architecture. It was a guide to building homes that strengthened families, communities, and the relationship between human needs and natural systems. The ideas deserved to reach the audience Tom had originally intended, and Jeremiah's restoration provided the proof of concept that publishers would need to understand their value. More importantly, completing the project properly would ensure that the Henderson family's tragedy served a purpose larger than grief. Their deaths would be remembered, not as a random misfortune, but as the catalyst that preserved and shared ideas capable of improving countless other lives. Standing in the unfinished workshop with snow tapping against the windows and Duke's warm presence beside him, Jeremiah Pike made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He would accept Kate Valdez's proposal, complete Tom Henderson's vision, and step out of the shadows to become the guardian and advocate for ideas that deserved to survive their creator. The morning brought Kate Valdez's return, along with a clear sky that transformed the snow-covered clearing into a landscape of crystalline perfection. Jeremiah was waiting on the porch when her rental car navigated the final bend, Duke alert beside him and a thermos of coffee steaming in the cold air. He'd spent the remaining hours before dawn planning not just his acceptance, but the conditions that would make the project successful on terms he could live with. "I've made my decision," he said as Kate climbed the porch steps, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid morning air. She paused at the top step, studying his expression with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading the subtle signs that preceded important announcements. "And I'll do it," Jeremiah replied, "but with conditions." Kate's relief was visible, but she maintained her professional composure as she settled into the chair he'd placed for her. "I'm listening." Over the next hour, Jeremiah outlined terms that reflected both his commitment to Tom Henderson's vision and his need to maintain the authentic relationship with mountain living that had drawn him to this place. The restoration would be completed according to Tom's original plans, with every detail documented for the manuscript and film. The property would accept its historical designation and become a demonstration site where other families could learn about sustainable mountain architecture, but Jeremiah would retain final approval over all aspects of the project's public presentation, ensuring that commercial considerations never overrode the educational mission. The foundation Kate proposed would operate according to principles Tom had outlined in his writings, supporting families who wanted to build authentic mountain homes rather than trophy properties, emphasizing traditional skills over expensive technology, and maintaining the kind of respectful relationship with wilderness that the Henderson family had been seeking. Most importantly, Jeremiah concluded, this place stays true to what Tom and Marie were trying to create. Not a museum, not a monument, but a working example of how families can build meaningful lives in harmony with mountain country. Kate listened with the focus of someone trained to identify potential problems in complex agreements. But her questions revealed enthusiasm rather than concern. The conditions Jeremiah proposed aligned perfectly with her own vision for honoring her sister's memory while preserving her brother-in-law's ideas. "There's one more thing," she said, reaching into her briefcase for a manila envelope that had remained sealed during their previous meeting. "Something I've been saving until I was certain you were the right person for this responsibility." The envelope contained a single photograph, professionally taken and carefully preserved, showing the Henderson family in front of their cabin during what appeared to be their final visit. But this wasn't a casual snapshot. It was a formal portrait, clearly planned and posed, with Tom and Marie flanking their children, while the restored cabin provided a backdrop that spoke to their dreams of permanence and belonging. On the back of the photograph, Marie had written a message in her distinctive script: "For whoever finds this place after us, may you understand that some dreams are meant to be shared, and may you have the courage to complete what love begins." The Henderson family, Christmas 1998. The inscription hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. Marie Henderson had somehow anticipated that their time at the cabin might be limited, and she'd prepared a message for the person who would eventually continue their work. The photograph wasn't just documentation, it was a commission, a request from beyond the grave for someone to ensure that their vision survived their absence. "She left this with my law firm," Kate explained, her voice thick with emotion, "with instructions that it should go to whoever showed genuine love for the cabin and understanding of what they'd been trying to create. I've been waiting 16 years for the right person to claim it." Jeremiah studied the photograph with trembling hands, seeing past the posed formality to the genuine joy in every face. Emma and Michael looked exactly as they had in the pictures he'd been carrying, but here they were, surrounded by the completed dream their parents had been working to achieve. The cabin behind them wasn't just restored, it was transformed, expanded, perfected according to Tom's vision of what mountain family life could become. "This is what it's supposed to look like when it's finished," he said. Understanding finally the full scope of the work ahead, Kate nodded. Tom had the photograph taken to use in his book, proof that his architectural theories actually worked for real families in real situations. But more than that, it represents their complete vision, not just a restored cabin, but a demonstration of what becomes possible when people have the courage to build lives that honor both human needs and natural beauty. The photograph became the final piece of evidence Jeremiah needed to understand his role in a story much larger than personal redemption. He wasn't just completing a construction project, he was fulfilling a commission from people who trusted that someone would eventually understand the value of what they'd started. standing on the porch with Kate beside him and Duke at his feet, holding a photograph that proved his restoration was meant to be shared with the world. Jeremiah Pike accepted the transformation from solitary mountain man to guardian of a legacy that could influence generations of families seeking to build authentic lives in wild places. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in 16 years, he understood exactly what that work was meant to accomplish. Spring returned to the Colorado Rockies with the gradual persistence of all mountain seasons, melting snow into singing creeks and coaxing wildflowers from soil that had been frozen for 6 months. The Henderson cabin stood complete in the clearing, its expansion finished according to Tom's original vision, but enhanced by details that could only have emerged from months of living. With the family's dreams, the workshop hummed with activity as Jeremiah demonstrated traditional joinery techniques to the documentary crew, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency, while Michael Torres captured every nuance of craftsmanship that had brought Tom Henderson's vision to life. The filmmaker had proven to be more collaborator than observer, understanding that the restoration's significance lay not in dramatic revelation, but in patient dedication to work that honored both technical excellence and emotional authenticity. The key, Jeremiah explained to the camera while fitting a hand-carved joint, is understanding that every piece of wood has its own character, its own way of wanting to fit into the whole. Tom Henderson knew that, and he designed this place to work with materials instead of fighting against them. The book manuscript had grown beyond Tom's original vision, incorporating not just architectural plans and building techniques, but the deeper philosophy that emerged from completing work interrupted by tragedy. Kate Valdez had proven to be a skillful collaborator, her legal training providing the organizational structure that transformed scattered ideas into coherent principles capable of guiding other families toward authentic mountain living. But the project's most satisfying development had been its impact on the Millfield community. Sarah and Frank McKinnon had become unofficial ambassadors for Tom's architectural philosophy, sharing his ideas with visitors who came, seeking the same kind of authentic mountain life the Hendersons had been creating. Dr. Patricia Valdez had established a medical practice that specialized in the health challenges of remote living, using the cabin as an example of how proper planning could minimize the risks while maximizing the benefits of wilderness life. Even young Tommy McKinnon had found his role in the project's expansion, becoming an expert guide who could explain the cabin's technical innovations to visitors while sharing stories about the family who'd inspired its creation. His enthusiasm for the Henderson legacy had infected his classmates, creating a generation of local children who understood that building homes in the mountains was both an art and a responsibility. The property deed transfer had been completed in a ceremony that brought together everyone whose lives had been touched by Jeremiah's restoration work. Standing on the completed porch with Duke beside him and the mountains rising in every direction, Jeremiah had signed papers that made him the legal owner of land he'd been claiming through sweat and dedication for months. But ownership, he'd discovered, was less about legal rights than about accepting responsibility for preserving something precious. The cabin would never be his private retreat. It was meant to be shared, to serve as proof that Tom Henderson's ideas about mountain architecture could create homes that strengthened both families and communities. The historical designation had brought its own rewards and challenges. Visitors arrived regularly now, some drawn by curiosity about the restoration story, others seeking practical advice about building their own mountain homes. Jeremiah had learned to balance his need for privacy with the public education mission that had become central to honoring the Henderson legacy. Most satisfying were the families who came seeking guidance for their own mountain building projects. Tom's manuscript, now nearing publication, had attracted attention from people across the country who wanted to create homes that reflected the same values the Hendersons had been pursuing. Jeremiah found himself consulting on projects in Montana, Wyoming, and New Mexico, helping other families adapt Tom's principles to their own specific situations and dreams. The Chi Sei foundation Kate had established was already funding its first construction project, a young couple in Utah who'd saved for years to build a cabin where they could raise their children away from urban pressures. Using Tom's designs and Jeremiah's guidance, they were creating their own version of the authentic mountain life that had drawn the Hendersons to Colorado 16 years earlier. But perhaps the most meaningful development had been the quiet transformation in Jeremiah himself. The solitary mountain man who'd arrived at an abandoned cabin carrying photographs of strangers had evolved into someone who understood that the most important work often involved connecting with others rather than retreating from them. His skills as a craftsman had always been exceptional, but his role as guardian of Tom Henderson's legacy had taught him that technical excellence reached its highest expression when it served purposes larger than personal satisfaction. The anniversary of the Henderson family's death, Jeremiah stood in the cabin's completed living room with Marie's final photograph displayed prominently on the mantelpiece Tom had designed for family memories. The room was exactly as the family had envisioned it, warm, welcoming, and perfectly adapted to mountain living. But it was also something more. It was proof that love could transcend tragedy. The dreams interrupted by death could be completed by strangers who understood their value. Duke padded over from his favorite spot beside the fireplace, his graying muzzle a reminder that their partnership had endured through challenges neither of them could have anticipated. The dog's presence had been constant through every stage of the restoration. From the first day when they'd assessed the abandoned ruin to this moment when the completed cabin served as a beacon for families seeking authentic relationships with wilderness. As evening approached and the mountains caught the last light of another perfect day, Jeremiah understood that his work at the Henderson cabin had been simultaneously an ending and a beginning. He'd completed the memorial he'd never known he was meant to build, honored a family's dreams in ways that ensured their legacy would influence generations of mountain builders, and discovered that the most meaningful solitude came not from avoiding human connection, but from choosing carefully which connections deserved protection and preservation. The mountains themselves seemed to approve, their eternal presence a reminder that some things endure because someone cares enough to ensure they survive. In the growing darkness, the restored cabin glowed with the warm light of home, exactly as Tom and Marie Henderson had dreamed it would, ready to inspire countless other families brave enough to build their own perfect lives in harmony with the wild places that called to their hearts.